trumpeter swans have nested at Rollins Savannah for the past few years. Sometimes you can see 7 or 8 at a time flying over. And they can also be seen at Pine Dunes in Antioch. And those of you who were on our field trip there last October may remember seeing them there as we walked the trail. And that's what inspired tonight's program, because the trumpeter swan is another species that has come back from the brink over the last century. Gary Ivey, our speaker tonight, is beaming in from Oregon to tell the story. Gary is the president of the Trumpeter Swan Society and is leading efforts to restore breeding trumpeter swans to Oregon. He's worked with wildlife for over 40 years, concentrating his work on waterbirds, waterfowl, and wetland conservation. He served for 20 years as a biologist at several Western refuge, including 15 years at the Mahler Refuge. Gary studied nesting ecology of sandhill cranes for his master's thesis and wintering ecology of sandhill cranes for his PhD, both at Oregon State University. And because of that background, he now works with the International Crane Foundation in Wisconsin as a research associate, and he's an expert on sandhill cranes in the Pacific Flyway. But for tonight, Gary's going to tell us about trumpeter swans, our biggest native waterfowl, how they're doing, and why we should care. Welcome, Gary. Thanks for accepting our invitation.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is this better?
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. Okay, I started my career, one of my early jobs in wildlife in 1979 as a lowly biological technician at Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, which I mentioned earlier. Beautiful place. If you ever get to Oregon, it's the best birding place in the state. May is the month to be at Malheur for all the songbirds. They get a lot of rarities there, but a lot of the Western species are nesting there. Lots of water birds like white-faced ibises and pelicans and egrets and herons and so forth. So it's a wonderful place to visit. It's Disneyland for birders. Anyway, in 1979, I was working on a nesting study, and there was a trumpeter swan nest on one of my study plots. And I've been working on swans, trumpeters, basically since 1979, because I started a research project the next year as a volunteer, and I've been tracking this Malheur flock and the Oregon flock. I'm trying to get them back on their feet. That's just a long story. I'll talk a little bit about that, but let me try to share my screen. I'm here today representing the Trumpeter Swan Society. The society was founded in 1968, and basically a bunch of waterfowl biologists that love trumpeter swans. It was actually started up at Hennepin Parks, a state park in Minnesota, started the society, but I've been a member personally since 1984, and it's got a lot of great people that really care about trumpeter swans and have helped further along all the success they've had. So they're a beautiful bird. I know you'll like lots of songbirds and so forth. Trumpeter swans are definitely one of my favorite. I've got lots of favorites, but the swans they're just so majestic. They were nearly lost to extinction at the turn of the last century, and I'll talk more about that. But first, some of you may not be, probably most of you birders know pretty well the 3 different swan species that you might see in Illinois. Trumpeters apparently are nesting there now, but tundra swans come down in migration. And of course, you have some feral mute swans probably around, I assume. And so those are the 3 birds, the mute swan on the left, the trumpeter swan in the middle, and the tundra on the right. And how do you tell them apart? The juveniles are really kind of tough, but with a little practice, generally the juvenile that you see in the winter, juvenile trumpeter swans tend to be a lot smokier gray than the juvenile tundra swans. But if you look at let's see if my arrow will work here. Yeah. If you look at the shape of the bill, you've got a nice, very angular skull and a very flat slope here on the trumpeter. And with the tundra swan, you've got a very rounded skull and more of a little slope which curves up a little bit. Only about 50–60% of the tundras have this teardrop, which is a good indicator, although some trumpeters will have a little yellow wash, not quite as distinct as a tundra swan. If you think about the length of the bill, well, here's what I look at mostly is the shape of the mask. Here you can see a distinct eye on this tundra swan, and here the eye appears to be part of the mask. So you got this big kind of V-shaped curve here. It goes back to the eye, and here it's more of a little straight up and then back to the V. There's this little straight spot here on the tundra swan, which helps. There's a snow goose for comparison. Again, pretty much what I just told you, but you've got more of a little dip in the bill on a tundra swan. And here's another shot. Again, the rounder skull, was good here, but the eye is very distinct on tundra swans, usually. Also, trumpeters tend to have a pretty pronounced V between the eyes here at the top of the bill. Well, tundra swans tend to have a U, but I have seen some tundra swans with more of a V, so that's not 100%. You have to kind of combine these characters when you're trying to consider. And then, of course, the body size is another factor. That trumpeters are about a third larger than the tundras, and if you see them together, the size is very striking. So now that you've got that down, what do we have in this photo? I won't wait for your answers, but we have two trumpeters in the back. Look at how the eye is kind of part of that mask on the bird on the left, and then the tundra swan in the front with a distinct eye and a rounder head and a much smaller bird. These are in the back, and you can see how much larger they are. So what's this? Think about it for a second. These guys are very dusky, these cygnets, and the eye is not very distinct. So we've got trumpeters in this slide. You might see some eyes that seem separate from the mask, and it actually helps kind of if they're a little out of focus, because you can see the eye, the mask, and then the eye. But these guys are pretty distinctive. Again, these are tundra swans. And again, these are trumpeters with the big masks extending way back to the eye there, and the eye looking like it's part of the mask. This one's also a tundra swan. Looks a little bit like a trumpeter, but you can see the yellow teardrop here, and it's got its head in a different position, so it looks a little like a different shape. So what are these? These are tundra swans. Again, you can see the eyes kind of separate from the black and the beak. Little history. This is Winston Bako did his monograph on trumpeter swans in 1960, which was published as a North America fauna series. And this was his map of the historic distribution of trumpeters. And talking to Winston, he passed away about 5 years ago, but he said that he didn't feel like he had all the information. He spent a lot of time looking for pioneer diaries and all the records he could find. But since this was published, there's been a few other papers showing that they were all the way out to the East Coast. So generally, they were in these upper tier of the states and in most of Canada and Alaska, the south half of Alaska. But if you go back 20,000 years, most of their habitat in his map was under the glaciated Laurentine ice sheet. So they couldn't have been there all this time. I mean, they had to move south to survive during that glaciation period. And what he was seeing in that historic, when European settlers came, what they were seeing was the results of birds pioneering into new habitat over the last 20,000 years up north. I work on the Oregon project, and I've been questioned because Oregon wasn't on that previous map in their historical range. And so I get questions about why are we restoring trumpeters to Oregon when there's no evidence that they nested there. Most of you probably know who this is. This is John Muir, the father of Yosemite National Park. And I found one of his writings in one of his journals that his favorite birds are the Yosemite Sierra, and this is California. The Sierras south of Oregon, of course. And they were he said it's the caw, the Clark's crow, which is the nutcracker, the garunk of the crane, and he says the trumpet of the swan. And then he also talks about in that same book that he was down at Mono Lake, which is a little alkaline, it's a big alkaline lake on the east side of Yosemite, down in the desert in the head of the Owens Valley, up above the Owens Valley. And he talks about seeing a raft of swans in the estuary, he calls it, where the fresh water comes into that salty system, on June 23rd, 1853. And a raft of swans in June would not be tundra swans. They're up in the tundra in the Arctic during the summer. So they would have been non-breeding trumpeter swans, which if there was a flock of non-breeders that big, there were some breeders pretty close because those juveniles don't go that far from their natal areas where they were hatched. So anyway, that's evidence, but there are several other records, not of breeding, but of swans being in Oregon during the breeding season back in the 1920s, including one at Malheur Refuge where I used to work. This slide here shows some market hunting activity, and this one family lived in a little town called the Narrows. That's no longer there, but it's part of the Malheur Refuge system area now, and there was a caption in this, it's in the museum there in Burns, and the caption was that this family was probably mostly responsible for the establishment of Malheur Refuge because it was established to protect birds from market hunting. They were shooting a lot of great egrets for their plumes and a lot of swans and geese and ducks for their meat. And there was a lot of activity, especially in the West, with market hunting to provide meat for hungry settlers and gold rush people and that kind of thing. So they were market hunted in California on their wintering grounds. They were shot any place they stopped during spring and fall migration that weren't protected. So that was devastating to trumpeter swans because they lived down in the temperate zones where people lived all year. The tundra swans were a little bit protected because they at least spend half the year up in the tundra away from civilization. The fur trade was a big problem for trumpeter swans, and actually Hudson Bay Company and other fur traders traded in swan skins, just in addition to beaver pelts. They sold swan skins, and they would basically, the feathers had a little value for bedding, and the quills, John James Audubon's favorite writing instrument was a trumpeter swan quill. Those had some value, but the big value in the swan skins was plucking all the feathers off, leaving the down on the skin, and then tanning those skins with the down on them. And those were sold for powder puffs, for all the powder makeup that Europeans and Americans used back in the 1700s, 16, 17, 1800s as makeup. And so they didn't have synthetic powder puffs we have today. They used swan skin powder puffs. And that's what really decimated the swans. This map, again, shows Winston Banco's historic range. And if you see these little red dots on the map here on the right, that's where all the Hudson Bay forts were. And you can see there's a lot of overlap between the forts, the trapping, fur bearing industry, and the trumpeter swan breeding range. So they had a big impact on trumpeter swans, as well as the settlers who, swans were a big meal and they were very targeted. And if you live near a breeding pair of swans, they're very defensive of their nest, real easy to approach and shoot. So they were wiped out. By 1932, the estimate was there were only 69 trumpeters left in the lower 48 states. And those were mostly in the Centennial Valley, which is now subsequently was established as Red Rock Lakes National Wildlife Refuge in southwest Montana. And the Centennial Valley and Yellowstone National Park, which used to have up to 30 pairs, they were down to 2 pairs about 4 years ago. And then the park has been working with the Swan Society and other partners. And now this last year, I think they had 4 pairs. So they're trying to rebuild, but they've got a lot of issues in Yellowstone with disturbance at the nesting sites because there's so many visitors and hikers and fishermen. It's a problem, but the park's trying to resolve that at some level. But Red Rock Lakes was the kind of the heart of the remaining trumpeter swans back in the 30s. Shortly after that, they started moving birds to Malheur Refuge, which is out here in the Great Basin in the sagebrush desert of Eastern Oregon. And then eventually they started moving into the Elk Refuge there in Jackson, Turnbull Refuge up in Washington near Spokane, and Ruby Lake Refuge in Nevada south of Elko. And then in the 60s, they started moving to Little Creek Refuge in South Dakota. So those were the original restoration programs. They were the biologists didn't understand trumpeter swans very well, and so they created these isolated flocks that weren't connected, and it kind of caused some issues with their population viability in some cases, because they had low numbers to start with. The birds had lost, when they got down to that level of number, the birds that survived are birds that had a tradition of not leaving that greater Yellowstone region in the winter, which is very harsh and hard for hunters to get in there and wipe them out, because there's a bunch of hot springs and thermal activity keeping open water in that area. So those are the birds that survive, but those are birds that did not have a tradition to migrate to good wintering sites. The birds that migrated to really nice places to spend the winter and feed were shot by market hunting mostly. So we wiped out their knowledge, that flock knowledge of where they should go in the winter, unfortunately. So in 1962, just to review, there were 69 in the greater Yellowstone region, which became the Rocky Mountain population. I'll talk about that a little bit more. That's the US flocks of the Rocky Mountain population. But in 1918, I guess the United States biologists didn't talk to the Canadians very well, but in 1918, they counted 78 trumpeters in Grand Prairie, Alberta. So there was two different places where trumpeters were known to have survived early in the century. And then when we got Alaska in the 50s, they were discovered in Alaska as well. And they did the first count in Alaska in 1968 and came up with almost 2,000. And that group has become the Pacific Coast population, which I'll talk more about. So basically you have these three sources, and the Rocky Mountain population genetically are very similar to the US and Canadian flocks are very similar genetically. The Alaska birds are also in British Columbia and a couple other provinces, and they're a different type of trumpeter genetically, but not that much different. The trumpeter swans, the genetic studies have found they're the least diverse genetic, they have the least genetic diversity of any waterfowl species that's known to science. So they're not that different. So the interior population, which includes the birds in Illinois, started in 1960 at the Creek Refuge with introductions there. And they call that the High Plains flock, which mostly now nests in Nebraska. There's a few up north in Canada that are part of that flock that spend the winter together. In 1966, Hennepin Park in Minnesota started releases in Minnesota. I guess it was 1967 they helped form the Trumpeter Swan Society. In 1982, Minnesota DNR jumped into the mix with Hennepin Parks, and they started getting eggs from Alaska. So that originally these birds that were released and raised for projects were from Red Rock Lakes, Rocky Mountain stock. And then they started getting these Alaska stock, which are Pacific Coast population eggs, and mixed those in. Michigan, in their program, introduced zoo stock, which at that time, the zoo stock was mostly Rocky Mountain population stock because they came from birds that were from Red Rock Lakes. And Wisconsin focused mostly on Pacific flyway. Iowa started up in 1994, and I can't see my last, I think it's 1996, Ohio started their program. So that's the flock that you're dealing with in the Midwest. And it's all artificial because it's not the natural trumpeter swans that were there, which may have been a different type even historically, but genetically. Since 1968, beginning in 1975, they've done surveys of trumpeter swan populations every 5 years. This should say 2015 up at the top here, but that was the last survey. And until 1968, when they found a couple thousand birds in Alaska, they were considered an endangered species on the national list. Even that was long before the Endangered Species Act, so they're never formally a federal endangered species, but they were considered an endangered species and treated as such until they found the Alaska population. But they've also always been considered a kind of a rare and sensitive species, and several states have them on their endangered list. These are the results of the 2015 survey, which came up with almost 63,000 trumpeter swans. So that's a great success from the days when there were less than probably 3,000 total. Trying to read my notes here. So the biggest is this, the interior population, 25,000. It's become the largest group. And then this red line is the Pacific Coast population, which is just over 18,000. And when they did this survey, the Rocky Mountain population was 3,600, 3,700. And confusing myself again. Oh, wait a second. I see. I have the old, that's the 2000. I've got that wrong. Sorry. I'll go over these numbers in better detail a little later for the interior, but there were 27,000 in the interior. This is the total for 2005. The Rocky Mountain population was about 9,000 and the Pacific Coast was about 25,000. So that's what I should have said. I had the wrong slide in here. Oh, here we go. Yeah, those are the right numbers. About 63,000 total, just a little under 27,000 for the interior flock, 24,000 for the Pacific Coast, and 11,700 for the Rocky Mountain. So we can celebrate success. And this is where they kind of draw the boundaries of those different flocks. So this is the Creek High Plains flock area. These are the interior population. And there's also a little group up in Ontario that's part of the interior. They've been working on their program for about 20 years. So the range of the Pacific Coast population is basically Yukon, BC, Alaska. And these birds here in the Rocky Mountain, in these in the States, is the ones that are most concerned. I can't show you this, but in this survey, 2005, there were only 765. I can't see it on my screen because I've got this Zoom thing blocking it. But anyway, you can kind of see the numbers there. 765 adults in the lower 48 states in the West, and that's not a very viable or healthy flock. And so I'll be talking about that a little more. This shows the Canadian portion of the Rocky Mountain flock, almost 11,000 birds. And the slope of their increase, they've been increasing exponentially in Canada, while the US flocks have been pretty flat since 2015. They've gained a little bit in the last 10 years, but there hasn't been a survey since 2015 because the agencies decided they didn't have enough funding for the 2020 survey. So I'm going to talk about the Western flocks again a little bit more here. It's a strategic priority for the Swan Society because of the low numbers and they're very isolated. They have high extinction risk for some sites. Malheur Refuge, where I used to work, is down to 3 adult trumpeters last summer, and they lost the last breeding male over the summer, and so they've got 3 adult females. We're working on a project at Summer Lake, about 100 miles away. We're releasing birds, and we hope those birds find the Malheur females and help build that flock. I'll go into that story a little more, but their behavior contributes to their isolation because they only move around generally in migration and so forth based on what they learn from their parents. And so they tend to be very sedentary if their parents are sedentary. And a lot of these original restoration flocks are very sedentary. And the problem with Malheur is they didn't leave the refuge. And it's not a great place to spend the winter. Sometimes it gets 32 below there. Anyway, it's a big issue, but so the status isn't good, and also climate change, wetland dynamics are changing, so these wetlands in the Intermountain West are getting drier and drier, hotter summers and less snowpack. And their genetic diversity is very low, which limits their adaptability. So we're working with a bunch of partners in the greater Yellowstone area in Oregon to improve connectivity between these flocks, and we're trying to build what's known in science, wildlife science, as a metapopulation, trying to increase genetic diversity and lower extinction risk. Currently, this is where trumpeter swans are nesting, including these original restoration areas and more recent sites here in Southeast Idaho, several refuges in Southeast Idaho, Seed Skiddy Refuge in Wyoming, along the Green River in Wyoming, the Middle Madison, there's a project going on there, here up near north of Missoula, the Blackfoot Challenge Project, and then the Flathead Salish Kootenai tribe started a big project on the reservation there and in Flathead, and they've got a great program going. A good portion of the swans in the States are in that Flathead area. As I mentioned, their behavior contributes to isolation. When we started moving swans to Summer Lake Wildlife Area, we started taking cygnets from their parents. We leave half of them with the adults and take half of them to Summer Lake. They actually had higher survival at Summer Lake because it doesn't have this severe winters and it's got some other issues that make it better feeding. And anyway, if they don't have their parents to spend the winter with, they explore, and we just see these crazy movements. We had three birds, and they were siblings that went down to Independence, California, which is by Death Valley, and came back to Summer Lake. And a couple of years later, one of those was nesting about 60 miles from Summer Lake. But they go to BC. They had birds go to Utah, wintering in California, and they're learning, if they survive to breed, learning new winter sites. And that's happening in the Midwest too. Some of these birds are learning to winter further south and reclaiming some of the historic winter areas, hopefully. So this is kind of my big vision of connecting all these spots and some other sites that weren't on that previous map that I think we need to start putting swans in so that they can connect and find each other more readily and help the population grow like it should. It's far from being there as a healthy population in the States. I'm going to move on briefly and talk about the Pacific Coast population, which breeds in Alaska, Yukon, BC, and winters mostly in southern BC, southwest BC, and northwest Washington, north of Seattle, and around the Vancouver, BC area, and Fraser Lowlands, Fraser River lowlands there. So that roughly 24,000 adult trumpeters were counted in 2015. About 85% of those birds wintering there depend on dairies, mostly dairies in that region. And dairies are an endangered habitat because of economic pressures. Dairies are moving out of that area. They're moving into the east side of the state and becoming huge corporate dairies, and small dairies are disappearing. So the dairies provide corn, and the swans feed on the waste corn after harvest. And they also plant a lot of green crops over the winter as cover crops and for cattle feed. And so the winter wheat and some of the other grasses they plant are swan and goose food, and those habitats are disappearing. They also use coastal wetlands, but they're not nearly as popular as the agricultural habitat. And it's being lost to urbanization to some degree, but mostly they're converting to berry crops because there's more money in growing berries than there is raising milk cows, I guess. And some of the habitat issues, they're restoring streams for salmon, which has taken out a lot of swan habitat as well. So that's some of the issues there. They've also, for the last 20 years, the Swan Society has been a partner in monitoring a huge lead poisoning problem they have in that region. They lose 300 to 500 swans a year to lead poisoning and power line collisions, mostly to lead poisoning. And they found one of the major sites, and it was mitigated by blocking off the wetland area with a bunch of bamboo stakes to discourage swans from going into the area where the highest concentration of lead was. But it seems like in the last few years, other areas have popped up because they're still losing quite a bit of swans there. Lead's a big problem. If we continue to lose habitat, we'll lose the carrying capacity of the habitat, which could lead to population declines. So we're trying to build a partnership and a coalition to build a swanscape, a habitat there where there's some refuge areas, perhaps, and areas that are dedicated to feeding swans, particularly, and other waterfowl. Moving on to your interior population, the estimate was 27,000. And this is interesting because the population grew by fourfold since the 2010 survey. They changed methodology, particularly in Minnesota, Wisconsin, so it may not be directly comparable to the previous survey, but you can see Ontario has, at that time, had about 1,400. Now they're up to about 3,000, I think. There is no recent estimate for Minnesota, but 17,000 is phenomenal. It was 4,695 in Wisconsin, 3,000 in Michigan, 200 plus in Iowa, 150 in Ohio, 22 in New York, and 3 in Pennsylvania. And you see Illinois is not on here, but now it is. I understand, so we need to get a good count. at some point. I just wanted to bring your attention, if you go to our webpage, Trumpeter Swan Society, all one word, .org, you can go to the education and outreach tab and go down to the research support. We support various research projects with our North American Swan Fund, and one big one we've been supporting in the last couple of years is this GSM, which is cell phone technology, satellite telemetry, and they've been marking trumpeter swans in several Midwestern states. And you can zoom in and go to this link, which I kind of cut off here, but it's this trumpeter swan metafly link you see there in red, and you can find that on our webpage and click on that. And then you can go in and look at, you can select individual swans and see where they were marked and where they spent the winter. And, I'm sure there's some that were wintering in Illinois at some point, but it's very interesting and entertaining. So what are the threats to the future of trumpeter swans? Habitat loss is continuing. There's still some wetland drainage, but bigger problems are climate change and sea level rise in some areas where they're wintering in coastal areas. Climate change in the West is affecting wetland availability significantly. And up north in the Alaska area, in the northern regions, we're losing permafrost, and a lot of the wetlands that swans are using are supported by permafrost. And when the frost goes, it's basically old volcanic sandy type soils underneath, and they lose, basically wetlands just disappear, and the land subsides and habitat disappears. The other thing that's happening, a lot of the wetlands, particularly on the Kenai Peninsula, for example, are fed by glaciers, and the glaciers are disappearing, so the glacier flows are disappearing, so those wetlands are drying up. So in the future, they're going to face some serious challenges. And also, as I mentioned, they're losing waterfowl compatible agricultural habitat, especially in the Pacific flyway. Mortality issues, lead poisoning is the biggest non-natural mortality problem, and it's pretty ubiquitous. A lot of the birds in the Midwest, die from lead poisoning. I didn't mean to go to that slide yet, though. I can get back. Oops. There we go. Power lines are a big issue as well, particularly where they cross wetlands in areas where swans spend a lot of time. Illegal shootings is a problem, which is a public education thing, but people think they're snow geese, or a lot of them are shot by not hunters, but vandals who just like to shoot things. But those are all issues that we're trying to work on with the Swan Society in terms of education. For the lead poisoning, a couple of the states, Minnesota and Wisconsin, we've been working with them to encourage fishermen to get rid of the lead out of their tackle boxes. Small lead like split shot and jig heads kill loons and trumpeter swans significantly. And so there's the tackle exchange programs going on, and educating the fishermen kind of on a bottom up level. Years ago, we tried to sue to get the EPA to regulate lead in fishing tackle and firearms to protect swans and other birds from lead poisoning. That did not fly very well with it. People considered it a Second Amendment right to shoot lead. Anyway, so lead kills. One shot pellet can kill a swan, and we've had some swans with 30 or 40, either shotgun lead shot or fishing sinkers. And they die a really horrible death. They slowly starve because it paralyzes their muscles, and so they stop digesting, and food goes into their mouth. They're hungry, but it doesn't pass down their gullet, and they just get weaker and weaker. And you can chelate the birds, in rehab, and some of them will survive, but it's a very expensive process, and it's a miserable situation for wildlife species. A lot of eagles and hawks also suffer from lead poisoning as well. Lead's bad. We banned it from paint and gasoline. It's time we completely ban lead from these kind of sources in our environment that are affecting wildlife. They're not affecting the populations, but it's a tragedy that we allow these toxic metals to affect our birds. Power lines, especially as I mentioned, kill a bunch of swans, especially if they're anywhere near a nesting site or a major wintering area. We just lost a bird last week, one of our breeding pairs at Summer Lake, to a line that was on the edge of the wetland. We've taken out a line that was on the other side of the wetland that had killed about 6 swans a couple of years ago. We got the power company to bury it. And one little line next to a little motel at the end of this lake was still there, and one of the female of the pair hit it. So it's a tragedy that we're trying to work with the power company where we know there's problems and get them to remedy it. And as I mentioned, the illegal shootings, this happens more than you would think, particularly during hunting season, but all year. When I worked at Malheur, I had about 8 of my trumpeter swans shot with rifles. 15 years I was there. I'm wrapping this up, so I want to show you a cute picture of a swan cygnet and then make a pitch that, whoops, I thought I had another slide, but I want to make a pitch that you become a member of the Swan Society. It helps support us. If you don't want to be a member, we'd appreciate a donation, some sort of support. And if you want to ask questions via the chat, maybe that's an option. I'll turn it back over to Rena. Thank you.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you so much, Gary. I do have a few questions in the chat, and I'm sure others will come up. Bob Stanley asked a couple. Is the low genetic variability among trumpeters due to their recovery from such low numbers 90 years ago, or is it just thought to be just the way the species evolved?
It's apparently there was a previous bottleneck, and it was probably during the last ice age. I'm just speculating about that because I'm not a geneticist, but according to the geneticist, it was not a recent bottleneck, which was also a bottleneck when they got down to these low numbers back at the turn of the century. But it's the overall low diversity is because of some other issue that happened in their past. I think they got forced out of a lot of their breeding habitat during the ice age, and so that probably cut their diversity at some point.
Boy, and that's thousands of years later, so it doesn't change. And he also asked, how does the restoration of habitat for salmon negatively affect swan populations?
They restored in some parts of their wintering range in Washington, particularly, they were restoring old channels of the rivers that basically took out some of the agricultural fields and changed some of the wetlands that were basically they were isolated wetlands that the swans fed in that became part of the river and became more of a gravel river instead of and filled up with willows and aspen and things like that instead of being open areas that swans could use. So that's how that affected it.
What do they eat? That's my own question.
They like grain. That's what they're feeding, and green wheat and green grass that they plant cattle forage in the winter. Washington's unique. Northwest Washington, they get some severe weather, but generally it doesn't get super cold in the winter, so crops grow pretty much all winter there. Things like winter wheat and grasses, at least. And so in the Midwest, you wouldn't expect anything to grow in the winter, because of the cold. The temperatures at night are too cold. But anyway, but they also feed on mostly aquatic vegetation in wetlands and estuaries. They'll eat, occasionally you see them eating fish. They'll eat any kind of invert they can catch, but the bulk of their food is aquatic vegetation like sago, pondweed, and milfoil, things like that.
And I'm sorry, are they wintering in Washington, Oregon? Do they migrate?
Yes, the birds that are wintering in Northwest Washington are coming mostly from Alaska and Western BC, Northwestern BC. So they're migrating down there to the winter. And a few of those birds end up in Western Oregon as well, which has similar habitat, not quite as much corn, not as many dairies, but there's a few. And in recent years, we've just have seen more birder reports of trumpeters coming into Western Oregon, which I think is because they've lost habitat in Washington. So they seem to be exploring further south and hopefully finding enough food. But
so I'm sorry, these are again my questions. Are you saying that in general for all 3 populations, they are wintering in the lower 48, but they breed in Canada?
No, in the interior population, they're breeding in those states I summarized. Those were breeding numbers that I was giving.
Oh, good. Okay.
So and those birds, they're an artificially totally introduced population there in the Midwest, and they're learning and pioneering new winter sites. For example, the Riverlands area near, I'm trying to remember the towns there. near St. Louis, Missouri, that area has become a big wintering area. Some of the refuges further south the swans are finding them. They're starting to winter in Arkansas and a couple sites in fairly good numbers.
Oh.
So they slowly learning, historically they probably wintered all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico, in Texas and Louisiana. But there's a few that are making it to those southern states now in recent years. The Swan Society also has a trumpeter watch program. And if you see a trumpeter in a weird place, please report it to our trumpeter watch. We're trying to map out this expansion of their breeding range and expansion of their wintering range. So
yeah, you need to add Illinois.
Yes.
Okay, a couple more questions in the chat. I'm assuming, this is Francine, I'm assuming those collars are tracking collars. Are they problematic for eating or do they catch on things?
They're designed to cause no problems. They're super light. I think they weigh like, I forget, 80 grams. But they've been designed and used. I mean, the collar size and weight has been designed and been used for over 30 years on trumpeter swans without. The only place they've had problems with the plastic collars was in the greater Yellowstone area about 30 years ago, when conditions, it would get 50 to 60 below in that area. And in the last 20 years, it hasn't rarely gotten below 20 below. So it's moderated, but when it's 60 below, they get ice built up on the collars, and they've had some of the younger birds that were marked die from the ice. 10 pounds of ice that got stuck to their collar, but it's pretty rare to have any problem with those collars, and
Okay.
they don't seem to cause any problems, and they get a lot of great information from those.
Yeah, everyone always asks about collars on and bands and all that kind of stuff. Okay.
Yes.
How much do the trumpeters weigh? When do they start laying eggs? And do we know the oldest trumpeter on record?
Okay, a huge male can weigh up to like 35, 37 pounds. That's kind of on the high end. That's the heaviest flying bird in North America, the heaviest. They normally don't start breeding until they're 4 or 5 years old. They lay about, from 3 to 10 eggs, rarely 10, but I've seen one brood of 9 trumpeter swans. And what was the other question?
Oldest on record, if you know.
Oldest, I don't know off the top of my head, but roughly about 30 years.
Okay. We were just talking about the trumpeters in Illinois, and we have someone who said that she thought that she saw some in Barrington and North Barrington, but she was surprised they were on the Illinois. So as I said at the beginning of this, we know that they are at Rollins Savannah, which is until about 15 years ago, it was farming, and it's been reclaimed. It's a preserve, and then another preserve. These are both Lake County Forest preserves, and so pine dunes. So 2 sites at least local. Will the wind turbines be a hazard?
Generally, I don't know of any records of waterfowl hitting wind turbines. It's not swans for sure. I've never heard of that. But the problem with wind turbines is to get the power from the turbines to the, back to the transformer and power plant station. There's power lines involved. It's the power lines that they actually hit. And because these guys are big, heavy birds, they're not very maneuverable, and they fly in flocks, and the birds in the front of the flock block the vision of the birds in the back of the flock. And I've seen a couple times when cranes or swans have hit power lines, it's the birds in the back that can't see the lines because there's somebody blocking their view in the front that hit the lines, and sometimes they get electrocuted. Usually they break wings, and sometimes their necks, and sometimes they're outright killed, sometimes they're crippled. They're usually not very rehabbable because it's multiple fractures to their wings.
Okay, Carla also wanted to know, what's the estimated population before colonization? You mean, Carla?
Yeah, we've speculated about that, and some people think maybe it was 300,000.
Oh.
That's about the population of tundra swans, and they've got about the same breeding range size roughly up in the tundra as what was historically the trumpeter range. So I don't think that's too far off personally, but that's speculation.
Tundras have not encountered the same challenges, correct?
They didn't get the super bottlenecked from overhunting because they spent 6 months of the year up in the tundra where there were very few hunters. And so they didn't get the pressure. You know, the swans were breeding in the breeding season where people were settling and trappers were trapping during the breeding season. And so trumpeters were just 12 months out of the year, they were trapped and hunted, and tundra swans were at least protected during the breeding season, which means they got to raise a lot more young as well. And so they were more resilient. And there are about 300,000 tundra swans in two populations. About
Yeah,
half of them winter at Chesapeake Bay and the other half winter mostly California.
We have on the Mississippi River north of us in Wisconsin, it's a spectacle when they migrate in about November.
Yes.
Well, that's all that's in my chat. I want to thank you, Gary, very much for agreeing to speak to us and from Oregon, and very interesting. And I think all of us now who see a trumpeter around here are going to appreciate it much more. I encourage everyone to visit the Trumpeter Swan Society website. That's how I found Gary. Thank goodness. And again, thanks again. And I hope things go better for them. So,
Thanks a lot, Gary.
Thank you very much, Gary. That was great.
thank you.
Thank you.
Very good.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for joining us.
Good night.
Bye. And Gary, I'll be in touch. Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Goodbye.
Good night.